coming. It's a pleasure to see you here. My name is Greg Brzezinski, and I am the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. Just to introduce the Sigur Center, our purpose is to elevate the level of scholarship, policy discourse, and education about Asia in the Washington, D.C. community and in the United States more broadly. We do this through a number of events that cover pretty much all of Asia, but Taiwan is a sort of special focus of a lot of our Sigur Center programming. So we're very happy to have this event, this Taiwan Roundtable event. Before I introduce the moderator, I would just say a quick word that I don't see a lot of people in the audience that look like they're applying to graduate school necessarily, but if you are or know someone who is, I think you can see that we have a fantastic fantastic programming about Asia here and a fantastic Asian Studies faculty. So, please recommend them to look at the Elliott School and look at our Asian Studies MA program. I think we have faculty and centers and resources unlike any other place in the Washington area. To start our panel, the moderator for today's panel on Taiwan and post-crisis economic pathways, our moderator today I'm going to introduce is the Associate Director of the Sigur Center, Professor Deepa Alapalli, who is not only Associate Director of the Sigur Center, but she also is a Professor of Southeast Asian Politics here at GW and the Elliott School. She is the author and editor of numerous volumes, including, I believe her most recent one is on political extremism in South Asia. And she is also the director of the Rising Power Initiative. So please welcome Deepa Alapalli and the other panelists.
Thought I needed to get up after that heavy meal. So welcome, everyone. I'm so glad all of you could turn out in person here today. And, as we are going to be talking a lot about the economics, I should say that there's another meeting going on in Bali, the G20 meeting. Too soon to say what's happening and what to take away from it. Of course, we do know that Xi and Biden had a 3-hour meeting. So we'll be probably coming back again to reassess that as well. But today, we want to be looking very closely at some of the political economy drivers of U.S. Taiwan relations. In August, after the crisis, there has been a lot of movement, both in the military and in the defense and economic spheres, to bolster Taiwan and to have regional economic and political stability. And so today, we have 3 outstanding speakers, experts from a spectrum of experience, that will take us through starting with the U.S. Taiwan boosting economic and trade ties with Riley Walters, who is here from the Hudson Institute. He is the Japan chair there, and he has been a senior policy analyst and economist at the Heritage Foundation before joining the Hudson Institute. He has published a lot, and you have seen him, I'm sure, doing quite a bit on Taiwan-U.S. economic relations, which is why he was, his name immediately came to my mind when I was putting the panel together. Following Riley will be Vincent Wang, who's going to talk to us about Taiwan's economic agenda. What does Taiwan expect? What does it want in its agenda? And Vincent actually is joining us from Adelphi University in New York, where he's the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor of political science. He was formerly the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences at Ithaca College. Before that, he was also a political science professor. He's still, despite this huge administrative role that he's having, he's still managing to research and write. So kudos to you, Vincent. I'm not sure how you do that. And then the last words will be from Ambassador Kurt Tong, who's going to look at balancing the politics and economics of Taiwan trade with US. And because we know that it's not just all economics, there are a lot of other factors driving the relationship. Ambassador Tong is the managing partner at the Asia Group. He leads the teams focused on Japan, China, Hong Kong, and East Asia. He has 30 years of experience in the Department of State as a Foreign Service officer and as a senior member of the Foreign Service. I should say that he was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department from 2014 to 2016. So clearly, he is very well versed in both economics and in policy matters and politics. So with that, I will invite Riley to kick things off. You can either sit or stand up. I don't know what your preference is.
I'll sit.
Okay.
Heavy food. Check it down. No, thank you, Deepa, for inviting me to this, and thank you for letting me go first in case I end up covering some of the topics my esteemed panelists might also be talking about. I was asked to talk about how to boost U.S. Taiwan trade, and I'm going to try and mostly stick to the numbers. Sorry if you've heard some of these before, but if you haven't, I encourage you to take notes. One of the ways to look at this is we have to first look at the current U.S. Taiwan trade and economic relationship. It is the United States' 8th largest trading partner for goods. We traded over $100 billion worth of goods last year. A lot of the focus you might hear in the news is on semiconductors, but the U.S. also gets a lot of steel and aluminum, or steel and iron, audio and visual, computer and auto parts from Taiwan. And Taiwan is also a significant destination for U.S. vehicles, military equipment, industrial machines, wheat, and increasingly crude oil. I'll get to that in a little bit later. One thing that we saw during the pandemic, in fact, even though we're talking about, I think, you mentioned the August post-crisis, but we're still living through a pandemic crisis. I think one of the things that we saw during that is actually our trade with Taiwan was probably one of our least turbulent, meaning it had the fewer ups and downs than you might have seen with some of our other trading partners. And I think that's thanks to a lot of increasing demand for personal electronics because everyone was working from home. On the inverse of this, the United States is Taiwan's second largest trading partner in goods. It constitutes roughly 13% of Taiwan's total trade. It is reliant on American aircraft, agricultural, and machine tools, just to name a few. And it exports high percentages of games, transportation parts, metals, and home furnishings. So maybe your mattress is from Taiwan. So that's just sort of the raw numbers of trade. But trade is really more than just the trade of goods, right? Trade includes two things that I don't believe are always as frequently talked about, to include services and investment. Services is a traded commodity or good, if you will, and includes things like travel, transportation, financial services, and research and development, which is a big one. Now, the US and Taiwan aren't necessarily each other's greatest service trading partners. Taiwan is actually only the United States' 19th largest trading partner in services, but they still did 20 billion in services trade last year. And so one of the things that we've economists or trade analysts have sort of noted over the years, particularly before the pandemic, was since the global financial crisis in 2009, 2010, what we really saw was a decrease in the growth of global goods traded, while services traded globally continued to increase. And I think we could still see a lot of that. Global trade of services is, a good about 25% of the trade of global goods and services. And really over the last, I would say, decade has had an average growth of about 4%, while goods traded is not as high. One of the things you'll actually notice, and I was mentioning volatility in goods traded, If you look at services traded between the United States and Taiwan, it's actually been increasing steadily throughout the pandemic as well. You have to, of course, cut out travel services from that because every country's travel services just tanked 2 years ago. But that is an opportunity for growth. Travel, bouncing back, everyone's traveling again. To continue from that, though, I want to talk a little bit about investment because investment and trade are generally correlated, which means when a company invests in another country, especially a global company, more likely than not, they're looking to export their goods, not just into the region, but maybe back home as well. And so the U.S. accounts for roughly 13% of all non-Chinese foreign direct investment in Taiwan and 13% of all outbound investment from Taiwan. So a pretty significant partner. You've probably heard major investment announcements like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company's multiple investment announcements in the United States. You've heard Microsoft and Google announce investments in Taiwan. So it's a pretty strong relationship. And like I was saying, more investment can lead to more trade. And that's, we've had for now about 30 years of trade and investment framework talks between the United States and Taiwan. And so those are important. And this is why. We do have new economic dialogues between the United States and Taiwan. When I say new, I mean relatively new. Some are a few years old now, some are a couple years old. One of them we just met for the first time in October. And these all cover various issues, including trade, investment, technology, and it's all great. And those are great opportunities to continue a lot of these dialogues and looking for those opportunities. But if I can, I want to focus on two particular aspects. One is energy, and the other is digitalization, or digitization, however you want to say it. So talk about the August crisis. Taiwan is very energy dependent. It is an island nation, of course, and 98% of its energy is from imports. It's become increasingly reliant on natural gas, of course, crude oil being another one of them as it continues to phase out the use of nuclear energy. That being said, there's a lot of demand, domestic demand now for renewable energy as well. I mentioned nuclear. I should just say last December, there was a referendum held and 53% of voters rejected restarting any new nuclear power construction. So that being said, again, there's significant interest in investing in renewable energy. There's actually a lot of investment coming from Europe. The Danish company Ørsted is investing heavily in Taiwan's wind farms. But it has a lot of growth. It has a lot of catch-up that needs to be done because really something like 5% of Taiwan's total energy is renewable, and it's 5% isn't enough. So there's a lot of opportunities there. The second one is digitalization. I think President Tsai's effort to make Taiwan a digital hub has really paid off. You can really see this in something called the IMD World Digital Competitiveness ranking. They do this every year. It ranks each country's digital competitiveness based on a number of indicators. If you look at Taiwan, it ranks 11th overall in the world as the most digitally competitive. But if you break it down, if you go a little bit further into the details, it ranks number 1 in total R&D personnel per capita. It ranks 3rd in total expenditure on R&D as a percent of GDP. And it ranks 3rd in high-tech exports as a percent of GDP. The State Department every year puts out a report called its Investment Climate Report, where it works with their employees in various countries to evaluate the investment environment of each country. And so the one for Taiwan last year noted the leverage that Taiwan has, its strength in research and development as a benefit. So energy and digitalization being important. I was actually really happy. In October, the U.S. and Taiwan met for the Trade and Technology Information Council. This is one of these new conferences that I mentioned. And out of that, 7 MOUs were signed all focused on renewable energy and 5G telecommunications. Two final points that I can make. I mentioned bilateral trade and investment, but we live in a global world with global companies, and so not all, I guess you could say, U.S. Taiwan trade necessarily happens between U.S. and Taiwan. If we think of, for example, Apple, a lot of Apple manufacturing happens in Asia, not in the United States, but it's still an American company. And so one way to indirectly increase U.S. Taiwan's trade and investment opportunities is, of course, to encourage more trade and investment between our shared neutral partners like Japan, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Germany, Vietnam, all significant trading partners, and not just the United States, but Taiwan as well. And one last point, this one's a little bit wonky, but we don't really have a double taxation agreement with Taiwan. We have a number of tax agreements with dozens of countries, and we don't have one with Taiwan. The importance of this is when you're thinking about workers who work between both countries or companies that invest between both countries, you don't want to be taxed twice for doing the same work. You'd prefer to just be taxed once, which is again something we have with many countries. And so that would be, I think, an easy pickup alongside increasing trade with mutual partners, increasing opportunities for renewable energy, and of course digitalization. And with that, that's my comments.
Thank you, Riley, for giving us that really good opening overview of the economic relations and not just on trade. So let me now turn to Vincent and ask if he could drill down a bit more into the Taiwan side and give us a sense of what that might look like.
Thank you, Deepa, for inviting me to George Washington University, and also it's a distinct pleasure to serve on the same panel with Ambassador Tong and Mr. Walters. I want to begin with a point that may seem obvious, but needs to be stressed, because given the title of the panel, the post-crisis economic relations. Now, a crisis I actually broadly defined as sort of the political context. So I'm going to make one big argument is that we can't understand U.S. Taiwan economic relations without understanding the politics behind it. And of course, Ambassador Tong is going to clean up after me. So he's gonna, any mistake I make, he's gonna clean up. So let me just give you a few examples. Think about an outward looking economy like Taiwan that is always has historically been very interested in and paying attention to U.S. trade strategy. This point has been amply illustrated. For example, during the Cold War, Taiwan was in the U.S. camp, but it also pursued an export-led growth strategy. Therefore, Taiwan was oriented toward the U.S. system of production and investment. And then, of course, starting in the 1970s, when more and more countries began to forge the so-called free trade agreements or regional trade agreements, as the saying goes, good economics also make good politics. So Taiwan obviously joined the World Trade Organization in 2002, also wanted to participate on the bandwagon. Former President Obama's pivot to Asia, the economic pillar was actually the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a 12-nation, high-quality 21st century trade agreement. This is in contrast to a parallel effort, China-led effort at that time, it's called, which now is actually a reality, called RCEP, Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership. And of course, former President Trump's talked about Indo-Pacific, but he immediately withdrew from the TPP. And the remaining 11 countries form a smaller TPP called the CTTPP. But the invitation is always out for the United States to rejoin. I'll come back to this point in a moment. And Biden basically inherited the Indo-Pacific concept, and most recently, actually, this past May, launched the so-called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Notably, this did not include the traditional market access, market liberalization, and talk about all other issues. And of course, regrettably, it also did not include Taiwan for reasons I will explain in a moment. And of course, this past February, so Riley, you talk about the pandemic crisis, and my crisis was actually the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's also a crisis. That actually was a violation of territorial integrity of a sovereign nation, as well as a rule-based international system since 1945. That also, I would say, solidified the reorientation of formerly communist countries in East and the Central European countries. So the point is that there's not only a NATO expansion, but also an EU expansion. So now all these East European countries wanted to be part of the European Union. And also that Finland and Sweden want to join NATO as well. Of course, after the Ukrainian crisis, Taiwan and Ukraine have often been compared. So people talk about, the Russian invasion has spurred those Central European countries' decision. And then I think that the analogy of possible Chinese PRC use of force against Taiwan has actually underscored the urgency for U.S. Taiwan economic relationship. So this is the sort of the geostrategic context I want to make. The United States over time has actually employed different formats at different levels to engage with its trading partners. From the U.S. Trade Representative website, I found that U.S. Currently has 20 free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements in force. But in the Indo-Pacific, there are only 3, with Australia, Korea, and Singapore. The United States has 42 bilateral investment treaties in force, but in the Indo-Pacific, only Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So we can think a little bit about, the U.S. actually engaging with these South Asian nations a little differently than those nations with which it has free trade agreements. And then the United States has 68 so-called trade and investment framework agreements, known as TIFA. And in the Indo-Pacific, it has TIFA with most of the ASEAN nations individually and collectively. But most of them are developing countries, but also with New Zealand. And of course, with Taiwan, the United States engaged since 1994 until most recently, exclusively, or should I say primarily, with TIFA, under the TIFA framework. And of course, TIFA was on and off due to the pork and the beef issue, which was ultimately resolved last year. Now, when people talk about free trade agreements candidate, people usually think about 3 groups. One is your largest trading partners. The logic is very simple, that if you trade more with this country and the more you liberalize, the more your exports can benefit from access to that market. And the other group of candidate is regional partners. For example, the United States has free trade agreements with several Central European countries. This is sort of the prelude to the notion about common market. And finally, the US formed FTAs with certain countries like Jordan, Israel, Oman, Bahrain, Morocco, and so on. You can't say they are economically important, but they are strategically important, especially after 9/11, because these are Muslim countries, and the United States really wanted to have a stable Middle East. So where does Taiwan fit into all this? I think that Taiwan, as Riley has already mentioned, Taiwan is the 8th largest trading partner of the United States, with important service and goods trade, and bilateral two-way trade exceeded $100 billion last year for the first time. And various studies, including US government studies like Government Accounting Office, actually support US Taiwan Free Trade Agreement. Congress, which historically is very pro-Taiwan, and now even more so, also support a US Taiwan Free Trade Agreement on strategic ground. But the administration, the executive branch, historically has been more cautious because they have another very countervailing trend to balance, which is the concern of the PRC. And the PRC, of course, says that they principally object to any country with diplomatic relations to enter into talks with Taiwan on FTA, because they say that Taiwan is not a sovereign country, therefore it's not eligible. This is despite the fact that both Taiwan and China are members of the WTO, and WTO clearly allows free trade agreements among members. In fact, China and Taiwan have a free trade agreement. They just don't call it FTA, it's called the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, ECFA, since 2010. The situation is now, as I said, is seeing some promising change. I think the Biden administration has finally found a more active and I will say creative initiative to strengthen U.S. Taiwan economic relationship. And this might actually pave way for Taiwan's partnership with other partners. And in fact, this approach, as I will explain in a moment, will showcase Taiwan as quote unquote a force for good or neutralize or sidestep PRC's influence. This immediately, since I know that Kurt is going to be here today, so this immediately make me think about an analogy, and from the State Department side, it's called the GCTF, the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. This was founded in 2015 to basically select those areas or forums where the US and Taiwan can cooperate and can showcase Taiwan's expertise and positive contribution. And this has worked very well. So you can think about the Biden administration's economic approach is a GCTF approach. So what exactly is this? This is the so-called U.S. Taiwan Trade Initiative for the 21st century. It's a mouthful, but basically it does not tackle the traditional market access issue. So there's no, trade liberalization, but talk about 11 other areas ranging from state-owned enterprises to digitization, etc. And more importantly, it is, the way I see it, is actually a parallel to the IPEF, which I just mentioned, that the Biden administration, due to China's opposition and also the concern of the initial members, did not invite Taiwan into the IPEF. So basically, the Biden administration is offering Taiwan a IPEF-like side agreement. And this is a very interesting idea because I think that the Taiwan and the United States actually share more common values and more uniform levels of development than between the United States and some of these IPEF members. So progress in US Taiwan trade can actually spur progress in IPEF. And of course, the US plays such an important role. If there's such an agreement, it will actually ease the mind of many nations in Southeast Asia to follow suit. Certainly Japan and Australia will follow suit. And also that I think this right now is a good opportunity. I would say that because it's also more urgent. Not only there's a power transition, but also Xi Jinping's China. She has received a historic third term, and the United States is becoming more and more concerned about its China's activist, or should I say assertive foreign policy and foreign economic policy. For example, the One Belt, One Road, Asian Investment Bank, RCEP, and what I will call synthesization of the United Nations system. So the Biden administration is trying to roll back or to counteract with an economic initiative. Now, some critics will say that IPEF is a watered down version of TPP. I think that the verdict is still out, but I think that if the Biden administration can play IPEF and the U.S. Taiwan Trade Initiative well, mutually reinforcing, this could actually give the U.S. some initiative to roll back some of the Chinese game. Now, earlier I mentioned that the TPP has always been holding out a hand to the United States. I think the U.S. should consider rejoining the TPP. And if the U.S. rejoined the TPP, because other countries like Korea, Taiwan, and of course, China have already raised their hand, if the United States is in the TPP, TPP will change very drastically due to its composition. The US will also have influence to pave the way for Taiwan to enter the TPP. After all, several years ago, Taiwan had already raised a hand. So, of course, not everything is smooth, and there are some possible concerns. One, of course, is Chinese opposition. The other is the concerns of the initial IPEF members. And I'm also very concerned that in the past, some U.S. Taiwan economic initiatives have actually heard a lot of thunder, but actually seen very little rain. So I hope this time is different, that the trade negotiators between the United States and Taiwan just last week met in New York for 2 days, and they say they are on an accelerated timeline to produce a series of memorandum. I hope they will do it very quickly, because right now this is taking place in the context of very bad U.S.-China relations. I'm not saying that the best time to do it is actually when the U.S.-China relations is bad, but rather that this provides an opportunity when the diplomatic cost for blowback on U.S.-Taiwan trade relations will be minimized. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Vincent. And thanks to both my colleagues for pointing out 2 other crises, and I'm glad I didn't specify, at least in the title, which crisis I was talking about. Well, I think we have heard a bit of geopolitics from Vincent, and economics from Riley. Now, Ambassador Tom, now you've got the job of wrapping it up and telling us what the combination is of politics and economics and how you see that driving relations forward.
Which crisis were you?
I was during the August crisis,
The Pelosi crisis.
Pelosi crisis, right, and then you have the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis.
Okay, well, there's plenty of crises out there.
Yeah.
Well, let me just quickly then do a couple of things. One is from an analytical perspective, think about what is at stake or what the incentives are for the U.S. and Taiwan to strengthen and formalize and deepen their economic relationship that was described very accurately by Riley, and then highlight and amplify perhaps some of the impediments to doing so that were highlighted very well by Dr. Wong. The U.S. and Taiwan have a shared interest in several benefits that could proceed from deeper formalization of the economic relationship, either through the 21st Century Initiative that's currently ongoing, or a binding free trade agreement, or other formats for tighter, more solidified economic engagement. The first, of course, is the economic benefit that could accrue from that. And Dr. Wong described why the United States decides to have free trade agreements with any particular country. Usually it's because the counterpart is a friend, either strategic sense or in a shared value sense, because the project seems doable in terms of the politics in both sides of the negotiation, and because there's actual tangible economic benefit that could result from that agreement. And you're right to point out that, for example, in the case of Oman, wonderful little country, there's not going to be a whole lot of economic results stemming from a formalized relationship there, but then the difficulty is low and the other incentives are strong. But this question of economic benefit is significant. I think there have been a number of studies done that further formalizing the economic relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan, lowering of existing barriers and the like, would result in some additional deepening of the economic relationship. Right now, what the private sector is most keen on is additional deepening in high tech. Other sectors are getting less interest, but there are areas where there could be significant economic benefit resulting from tighter arrangements, particularly in terms of cross investment, and strengthening of some of the sectors where Taiwan is frankly not very competitive at all. For example, financial services. So there's economic benefit. On the political end of things, right, maybe second, on the economic policy and regional standing sense, from the U.S. perspective, having Taiwan pulled more tightly into the conversation on Indo-Pacific economic policy has benefits because Taiwan is generally like-minded with respect to those policies. It's generally market-oriented, has a reformist approach to most economic policy questions, is interested in internationalization of data flows, of lowering of trade barriers, et cetera. So having Taiwan added into the equation, as it is in the WTO or in APEC, but added in additional ways, is useful from the perspective of the United States in its attempt to shape a free and open Indo-Pacific type set of institutions for the economic policy in the region. It also has the benefit more politically, in a sense, of showing Taiwan as both an opportunity for the United States to show its leadership, and an opportunity for Taiwan to show its relevance. Take each of those in turn. For the United States, by having a deeper and stronger economic relationship, more formalized, more solidified with Taiwan, it can do that, and in doing so shows that it's putting substance ahead of politics. Given the opposition of the PRC to Taiwan's grasping of international space, by making that international space more available to Taiwan, the United States is showing both leadership in a regional sense, but also a commitment to the underlying values that are being reinforced through the arrangement. By talking with Taiwan intensively, as it's doing through the 21st century arrangement, the United States is sending a message that the value that Taiwan brings on these issues is tangible and therefore worth recognizing, amplifying, and highlighting through bilateral engagement, regardless of the opinions of the PRC. So it's an opportunity in that sense. It's also an opportunity, given that Taiwan is quite popular in the US these days, for the US to do that kind of engagement with less domestic political costs, but I'll come back to that. From the Taiwan perspective, having this kind of work coming from the United States and outreach provides an anchor and a relevance and a highlighting and a profiling that makes the rest of the region pay more attention to the value of Taiwan as an economic partner on a regional basis. And that highlighting is something that Taiwan can really benefit. It also establishes a sense of existence and recognition of Taiwan as a separate entity in the economic sphere. This is one of the tricks for the United States is to amplify Taiwan, recognition of Taiwan as a separate entity in the economic sphere without doing so in the political sphere, because to do so is contradictory of the one China policy, which President Biden reiterated yesterday with Xi Jinping. But it's entirely doable. So from the US perspective to do that highlighting, and from Taiwan perspective to have that highlighting done, creates more space, more identity on a regional basis for Taiwan, which can be a stabilizer in a lot of ways in terms of regional affairs. So those are the positive aspects, the goals for this kind of more formalized engagement. Now, caveat, as Riley, I think, was rightly emphasizing, business decision making has nothing to do with any of the stuff that I just talked about. has to do with whether you can make money through economic interactions. But in this political economy space, the things that I was mentioning are tangible benefits for stronger and more emphasized bilateral relations. So on the flip side, what are the impediments to achieving these goals? I think there are several that are most relevant to consideration of the way forward, particularly as if we focus on this 21st century initiative that is being led by USTR and Taiwan authorities in the current juncture. The first is some of the specific issues. I will be very curious to see whether some of the problems in the relationship are in fact raised and addressed in this format. Some of these are well-known issues, like in the agricultural space, where Taiwan's abuse of sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions over the years has been rather egregious and politicized, and that has been a problem in the economic relationship. But there are others that are perhaps more economically important. For example, the investment environment in Taiwan, can it be made more transparent? Can government regulation be depoliticized and made more transparent in order to accelerate the pace of investment in both directions? Can Taiwan's financial markets be made deeper and linked into global markets more efficiently? Those things will actually have a big impact. And I don't know whether those questions, Taiwan is both under less international competitive pressure because of its unique status. And some institutions in Taiwan are in need of a little bit of a shakeout and some upgrading. And whether this initiative can be part of that will remain to be seen. But that's an issue, because if you want to take things the next step, this step has to go well. The next step perhaps being a formalized free trade agreement. And then thinking about formalized free trade agreement and talking about impediments, that's when we get into the real politics of the question, because then we start to talk about involvement of legislatures. In order to get to a free trade agreement between the United States and Taiwan, which the U.S. has not offered to do, Taiwan has suggested it repeatedly for decades, but the United States has not offered to do that. One has to see whether protectionist policies can be overcome in a legislative sense, or whether there'll be a problem. On the U.S. side, in particular, this is a big issue, where we've found that thinking about a free trade agreement, and Riley's written about this, as have I, suggesting that it's a good idea. The difficulties with that have proven to be a little bit of superficiality in the U.S. Congress, in terms of Congress saying we'd love to have a free trade agreement with Taiwan, but then not doing anything about it, just signing letters, which is sort of a freebie for a legislator to do, and not putting any actual pressure on the administration to act, either the Trump administration or the Biden administration. And then in the case of the Biden administration, the trade representative having been, if I could say, captured by special interest groups on the NGO side of the equation, that are essentially pushing USTR in the direction of a very progressive trade policy agenda, which has very little Venn diagram overlap with the desires and intentions of other potential negotiating partners overseas. So that push to raise non-trade issues in a trade context that the U.S. is pushing very, very hard, and based around an anti-globalization attitude amongst urban elites in the United States, is a big impediment to realization of deeper Taiwan U.S. ties. I'm going on a little bit too long, but then the last factor that then needs to be taken into consideration is how to consider opposition from the PRC. PRC would like Taiwan not to ever have anything good happen to it, right? Let's just be honest. Regardless of what it is, even weather, they don't want to, they hope it rains every day in Taiwan. But that's not the way the world works. There are rainy days and sunny days. And the fact of the matter is that Taiwan, as Dr. Wong mentioned, has status under the WTO, which is recognized by the PRC. It has status under APEC, which is recognized by the PRC. PRC has, when it's in parent mode in its goal of reunification of Taiwan and China, has done a lot to recognize Taiwan's strengths and separateness in the economic sphere. All of which established, is in my mind, sufficient precedent for other countries to pursue deeper and stronger and more formalized economic relationships with Taiwan without needing to worry about the reaction from the PRC. But the PRC is non-transparent in the ways that it chooses to retaliate and pick a fight with different countries. This is why Dr. Wong is exactly right in saying that in current circumstances where the US is doing a lot more to make China angry on a much higher scale than a trade agreement with Taiwan would be, is actually an opportune time to do it, because it's like such a smaller thing than some of the other stuff the United States is doing, like a systematic program of technology denial towards PRC, which is much more relevant to China than whether there's a slightly deeper trading relationship with Taiwan. So I don't know if all that made sense. I'm not sure it entirely makes sense to me, but those are my observations at current stage, and we should probably proceed to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for bringing quite a lot of thoughtful perspective to this debate. And what I'd like to do is, we do have quite a lot of time for Q&A, so I promise to get to all of you, but I am going to take the prerogative as moderator to ask a question or two to the panelists. And let me just take off from what Ambassador just said about countries, and also reflecting what Vincent said about countries following free trade agreements for economic reasons. But as you point out, the United States has been doing it partly because it wants to expand Taiwan's international space, politically speaking, via economics. So after this crises have happened, let's just say all of the crises, but most recent one, the Pelosi one, I wonder in the Indo-Pacific whether there are more countries who are willing to perhaps engage in this kind of economic relationship as a substitute for politics. They really would like to have political, whatever they can do to expand Taiwan's political space. But I think I can think of a few countries that might be inclined to do that. How do you look at that development? And I want to ask Vincent, and then Professor Tong, if you want to expand on that.
Sure. I want to draw our attention to the two FTAs Taiwan was able to sign with its neighbors during the Ma administration, one with Singapore or the other with New Zealand. And that was, I think it's fair to say that happened during a period of relatively amicable relations between the mainland and Taiwan. And so right now, the global politics in that region is different because various countries are very concerned about China's very assertive behavior. But it is still a stretch to say that they will by itself, to do something with Taiwan. And my argument just now was that they are more likely to follow the US lead than being the first one.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would think that one of the intermediate goals then would be for sectoral agreements to be reached with Taiwan by a variety of Asian entities, Asian jurisdictions. One could see Japan, for example, doing an investment agreement with Taiwan. Maybe they already have one, I don't know. But they could do one on digital trade. Southeast Asian nations would have a very strong incentive to do investment promotion agreements with Taiwan. That investment being one of the main things that they seek from Taiwan technology companies. I think a sort of sectoral approach could be a good intermediate step as people kind of get warmed up to the idea.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, at least from some of the countries that I follow, like India, for example, are looking for ways to engage with Taiwan, and the sectoral approach sounds like it would make a lot of sense. Let me ask Riley, going back to something that you mentioned, Riley, about leveraging the Taiwan's leverage, especially in the digital arena. And you said that President Tsai is wanting to provide Taiwan as a kind of a digital hub. How do you see that having developed? I mean, what is Taiwan's role in that context? Its aim of being the hub, and how much leverage will that buy it?
We live in a digital economy, and it's going to become more autonomized and more digital. And it hits various. It comes at this from various angles. One is research and development, just so that there's a lot of opportunities for emerging technologies, and new energy types of energy, manufacturing, and so on and so forth. But there is still a manufacturing component of this, and of course, I think if you look at just the proliferation of announcements by semiconductor manufacturing companies, not just Taiwanese but others, over the last couple of years, they're banking a lot on this digitalization of the global economy. And so there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, as we look at how many more things are we going to, add a digital component to. And so it's really in Taiwan's benefit, I think, or it has been in Taiwan's benefit to become such an essential partner in this you could say supply chain, but just the development chain of new technologies. And I think it will continue to stay that way for quite a while.
Okay, so, all right, a lot of opportunity there. Okay, I'm now happy to open it up for Q&A, and I'll call on you, and if you could please identify yourself and your affiliation, that would be good. Yes, in the back there.
Thank you. My name is Michael Chen. I'm here in a personal capacity, but a couple of things I'm wondering about is, what's the influence of Taiwanese pop culture as an export? So I noticed there are some Taiwanese movies on Netflix, but I know they don't have much impact here, but some Taiwanese men and women are members of K-pop bands. The other thing I'm wondering about is also the role of Taiwanese Americans. We have a lot of Taiwanese Americans who are quite prominent now, like Jeremy Lin and several members of Congress. And so what do they have to bring to bear on the Taiwanese-US relations? Thank you.
Okay, that I suppose any one of you can answer that. Anybody want to? Yeah, you want to take this?
I probably watch too much Korean pop. No, I think that obviously the implication is that, yes, that's a growth area, right? There's a lot more to grow. And I think this is maybe the Taiwanese government can think more systematically about how to project its soft power. This is actually really in the realm of soft power. The role of Taiwanese Americans, yes, I like to see them as sort of the conduit or the bridge, because after all, we are talking about two like-minded and the democratic societies, sharing a lot of values. So this is different from, say, Chinese Americans. I think they are now really in a tough time because their allegiance is actually suspect. I mean, being questioned.
Okay, All right, let's see, yes.
Hi, I'm Darren. Oh, I don't need that. I'm very vocal.
Oh, we need it
I
for
think
the,
we need it
for the recording.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
sorry. But
Digitized, we are digitized.
I'm from the United Arab Emirates, so I can be very loud and wow, I don't like my voice on here. Okay, so my question is, I wrote it down right here, so. I want to jump back to one year ago. We were all watching TV, we all got scared and we knew what was coming. So my scene touches on threats and being scared. So recently, after the brutal invasion of Ukraine, we saw Russian President Vladimir Putin went up and just basically said and self-proclaimed that he's the best friend with Russia on world stage. The Atlantic then goes, just like last week, and writes an article and says, Taiwan prepares to be invaded. So if China wants to do something drastic, like, we have to keep in the mindset of like, are we in a stage where we're gonna come back to fear? Because there's a lot of articles right now that is saying Taiwan could be a target now by China. And even recently, like a couple of days ago at work,
Can you just, yeah.
I work at the embassy for Arab Emirates, and I read an article at the New Yorker, and so basically New Yorker publishes a dangerous games over Taiwan. So to correlate what I'm saying is, we've been seeing what's going on with these recent threats that are coming against Taiwan. Is there a way where we should prepare about Taiwan could be a target by China?
All right, thank you. Okay, very broad, big question. Again, is this,
And if you, anyone, if you can answer.
okay. Ambassador, you
I'll
want
take a
to?
shot. So
Sure.
President Biden yesterday said, after meeting with Xi Jinping, that he did not, I forget the exact quote, but he did not believe that a Chinese military action directed at Taiwan was imminent. But he also reiterated the standing U.S. commitment to try and help make sure that Taiwan is capable of deterring such aggression. I think fundamentally the situation in Taiwan and with respect to Taiwan, the situation in Ukraine are quite different. There are some similarities and in a superficial sense, but there are also significant differences, and it's probably beyond the scope of today's discussion to analyze I usually do that in about an hour and a half briefing on the likelihood of conflict over Taiwan. But I don't think it's something we need to be staying up worrying about night to night, but then rather it's something where the US and Taiwan need to consistently prepare the deterrent capability that will prevent such a thing from happening.
The 1 minute.
Thank you for your answer.
Read other news.
Okay, all right. Yeah, hold on.
Hi, my name is Jocelyn. I am a grad student at University of Maryland, so I am no way related to GW. But I do have a question, kind of what you were alluding to earlier about Taiwan's investment flow. The index of economic freedom rated them at 70 for investment freedom, which isn't like, it's a relatively well-developed system, but you alluded earlier that there are some barriers that could hinder Taiwan from accepting more foreign investment for things such as like sustainable energy development. So I wanted to know, what are other barriers that you think that from a Taiwan side that they could address within their framework to foster more foreign investment?
Start with Riley, I guess.
Sure. I mean, I don't have a comprehensive list, but if you go to the State Department's website and look at their investment climate report, they lay out a good sort of breadth of concerns on, you know, things that could probably be improved, or at least things to watch out for as a foreign or American investor looks to invest in Taiwan. usually these things tend to be around regulatory transparency. The last thing any company wants is to not know how long it's going to take to get something approved, because capital investment, takes years, some decades. So I don't know if any of you, I bought a home last year, and so I've been doing a lot of my own renovations and getting contractors to do work for you. Once one thing gets delayed, another thing gets delayed, and it just, snowball from there. And you don't want that.
Anybody else?
Well, I think that there are a few legal restrictions on investment into Taiwan, some of which are related to national security, which are not extraordinarily unusual in a global sense, global comparison, but they're there. There are also, as Riley alludes to, real concerns about transparency of decision making in business approvals process when government has reached into the business decision making. There was a piece you might look at in the Financial Times about a week ago, highlighting one set of circumstances around that where someone's been trying to sell a bank for a decade and is incapable of doing so, mainly for political reasons. So things like that end up stacking up, and capital just doesn't move that quickly in Taiwan, with the exception of the high tech sector, where the financing is largely self-generated, but then there's also good access to international capital because of the highly sophisticated nature of the firms. But the next tier down of Taiwan industry tends to have these kind of long-term, not so efficient relationships with banking institutions that lock them into place. It's that kind of environment. It's not dreadful, but there's room area for improvement.
I think there's another aspect, which is Ambassador Tong has actually alluded to just now, that Taiwan has not been exposed to the international pressure as much. The two reasons. One is that Taiwan is not a member of International Monetary Fund or most of the Keystone International Economic Organizations. So the Taiwanese fiscal policy or investment policy tend to be very conservative because they know that when they got into trouble, they cannot call on Washington. I'm talking about IMF, not State Department. And so that, and another reason is that earlier I mentioned that Taiwan has had very few free trade agreements in force. So it has actually not been facing a lot of pressure to liberalize. Although I, for one, had actually advocated for Taiwan to self-liberalize in order to make it a more attractive partner. But some of the Taiwanese bureaucrats think that these things should be discussed in a bilateral negotiation context. Ambassador Tong also mentioned this. So I think these are some of the reasons why you still see some very tight restrictions.
If I can jump on that, we see actually similar. You talked about sort of the push to liberalize sort of capital movement, and we see a similar issue in Japan, where some of the leading companies like car manufacturers are doing really well, but Japan has a lot of small medium enterprises, often run led by elderly folks who aren't as quick to capitalize on new technologies, and so you really see this almost like widening gap between some of the larger companies who are more modern looking, and some of the smaller ones who aren't.
Okay, yes. This gentleman here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I'm wondering how the future free trade agreement with Taiwan might mesh with the existing Canada, Mexico, US updated NAFTA trade agreement, in the sense that even now it's very easy to imagine Taiwan manufacturers increasingly moving to northern Mexico to create maquiladora, exporting both to Latin America and the US. So after a free trade agreement with Taiwan, that is certain to increase even radically. So how would that trade agreement mesh with the existing trade agreement? Since Mexican labor is so much cheaper than opening a factory in the US. And that's both chip manufacturing and electronic assembly.
Okay. I don't know who would want to take that very specific question. Any thoughts?
I guess I could
Okay.
take a stab at it. Well, for one, I mean, you're talking about one that would definitely be an issue for something like 10 to 20 years from whenever an agreement would start. I mean, we are already seeing massive semiconductor investments in the United States. So you're talking about somehow Mexican-made Taiwanese chips competing with American-made Taiwanese chips.
Already, there's Taiwan electronics manufacturer in the maquiladora, so it's already started. So don't say that.
Yeah. Well, it's I guess an issue for our negotiators to figure out. I mean, we have constant negotiations between Mexico and Canada on a variety of issues. So
I think the governing arrangement for items manufactured in Mexico and sent to the United States is the governing arrangement between the US and Mexico. If the US and Taiwan have an arrangement that could encourage additional cross investment that then leads to a stronger demand signal for Taiwan organized firms active in the United States to then invest and pull product in from Mexico. I'm not sure how large that impact would be, and I think as Riley's pointing out, some of the areas where Taiwan is most competitive have relatively small labor content in the items, and so Mexico doesn't immediately jump to be a great place to produce. But I think all in all, there will be likely be an increase in all three directions, both ways. So that makes 6. But then if you had Canada, anyways, lots more business being done.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
Well, it is a complicated matter because I know that third country involvement in this, for example, with RCEP, and there was fear for countries like India that somehow China would then use that, go into Sri Lanka, for example, and have a lot of investment in Sri Lanka and come through the backside into India. But I think in a situation where you have 3 friendly countries, I think there's a little bit of a difference as well.
The other thing that's relevant to this is that if the US and Taiwan were to negotiate, for the US and anybody were to negotiate a free trade agreement after the ratification of USMCA, the revised US-Canada-Mexico agreement, any of those agreements need to meet the standards of that USMCA or higher in order to have a chance in Congress. And so that I'm sure that people in Taipei or in other places, Hanoi, other places that are analyzing prospects of doing an agreement with the United States are aware of that fact and are basing the analysis on the USMCA as the benchmark.
Okay, thank you. Yes, in the front.
Yes, Tina Chung with Voice of America China branch. My question is, during the August crisis, people are very concerned about Taiwan, being in a blockade by China. So it probably affected some business decisions on investment or the risk for insurance and the cost. Now that President Biden has completed his meeting with President Xi, I wonder if you could give some of your takeaways on will there be a stabilizing effect in the Taiwan Strait in terms of doing business with Taiwan from other countries? Thank you.
Which one of you want to take that?
Okay.
You can go down the panel here.
So my initial thoughts are that this was the first in-person meeting between the 2 leaders, and they, although they did not agree with each other, but at least they have hurt each other. So I think that probably will help stabilize the relationship a little bit. And yeah, I think it also probably help many regional countries to sigh of relief, because the U.S. relations with China at the time seemed that there was actually no bottom. Maybe hopefully the summit meeting yesterday had actually found a bottom. So maybe, but those businesses who invest in Taiwan or China or anywhere else, this is part of their regular calculation. And you know that everywhere you invest, there's actually political risk. And in fact, that China has become more nationalistic and going backwards in terms of its economic policy. So many international businesses are also reassessing the risk of investing in China as well.
You wanna?
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think, whenever you're talking about political risk, there's a question of what is the actual risk, and then the question of perceived risk. Calculating actual risk is a very difficult thing to do, and so what you end up doing is talking about perceived risk. I think the Pelosi visit substantially raised perceived risk with respect to doing business in or with Taiwan. And I think the Biden-Xi meeting probably lowered it. My sense is that the degree to which risk went up during the Pelosi visit was still of a larger magnitude than the lowering of it based upon the Biden-Xi meeting. But if there's additional strong follow-up on that meeting, Secretary Blinken's going to travel to China, and there is, for example, today they're talking about resuming military-to-military talks. That would be a very positive thing to have happen in lowering both perceived and actual risk, and other additional follow-up measures which could lead to a more stable situation. I think the relationship itself, both sides were characterizing still as a very contentious one, with the U.S. using the word competition in every sentence and its discussion of China. But I perceive the U.S. goal as trying to lower risk while maintaining competition, and yesterday was a good day for that project.
I agree with both what Dr. Wong and Ambassador Kirk said. The one I think difficulty we have nowadays is I think a lot of businesses are still trying to figure out how they measure political risk in their analysis, and not all of them are taking it equally. It's a learning process. And so I can both hear the sigh of relief, I think, from a lot of capitals across Asia. But at the same time, like Ambassador Tom was saying, the Pelosi visit, actually we had an event recently, for example, for like Japanese businesses, one term was like the missile launches that landed in Japanese water was almost like a new black ship for Japan. When Commodore Perry opened up Japan to the world again. And so, companies are thinking about what does it mean, going back to the discussion about Ukraine, what does it mean if a Ukraine situation happens with Taiwan? Companies can't access their capital where things have shut down. And not just within Taiwan, but China, of course, as well. If once sanctions and other things start to play out, companies, again, it's not a science just yet, but it's something I think people are thinking about.
Okay, thank you. In the very back.
Thank you very much. I'm the first year student in GW, and I used to work in legislative branch in Taiwan. And my boss is the chairman of economic committee. So I have experience with dealing with the U.S. Taiwan 21st Century Trade Initiative and also CPTPP. So I have two questions. First one is how Japan can play a role in pushing Taiwan to not be excluded. Especially for Japan's role. I agree, U.S. can play important role. And because I manage economic security talk with Japan's party, and I know Japan really cares about economic security. So I think that Japan can play a role. I just want to make clear that how Japan play a role. And second question is like the European, because we have like some initiative with French, with Germany, and also with Lithuania. So how can like Taiwan be more engaged with European market, and how can they just make more connection with between the two countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe you should be up here on panel as well. Okay, so we can pick and choose Japan question and the European question. I know we have two Japanese. Yeah. Japan.
It's really as a facilitator, United States, if we were in it, I would like to think, we would play a facilitating role, but we're not. So our leverage, you could say, is not really there. I mean, we could still play, behind the doors, kind of behind the scenes kind of facilitating role, maybe encourage like Canada and others to go ahead with that, but it's really up to Japan at this point. And they do have a lot of leverage. If you look at Southeast Asian nations polled, Japan is their either number one or number two preferred economic partner in the region, or they would like to. It's different from what's actually on the ground. So that's pretty much it. It's just facilitating, working with especially those members of CPTPP who have voting rights, who are on the fence to come to their side.
Kurt, you said you just came back from Japan, I think, right?
Mhm.
Do you want to say?
Well,
anything
I
about
agree
this?
with Bradley. I think that Japan is leaning in the direction of doing more to deepen its bilateral relationship with Taiwan, and also give Taiwan a leg up in the economic sphere regionally. But it's a work in progress, and there is some hesitance to do that because of the factor I cited about possible PRC retaliation, but also just a general inertia and reluctance to take controversial positions and push them regionally. And with time, I think Japan could play a much stronger role. My own suggestion to Japanese colleagues has been to focus on their bilateral relationship with Taiwan first, and go ahead and do the obvious things there, including a free trade agreement, which would be quite doable in terms of Japanese domestic politics, Taiwan politics, and the substance of the agreement. They're not there yet, but I think it's worth pushing. With respect to Europe, I think that Europe's a big place and very diverse in a lot of countries, and so the strategy which you're implicitly mentioning of Taiwan focusing on a few particularly friendly and important countries makes sense, rather than trying to wave hands and get the attention of the EU, which is a behemoth of immense proportions and very confusing to work with and complicated for small countries to engage with from outside. So I don't know which counterparts those are. Someone else would need to do that analysis for you.
Maybe just
Yeah, go ahead.
just one point of contrarian wisdom. I agree with Riley and Ambassador Tom that I think the Japanese are generally very in favor of doing more with Taiwan. I think that's not the issue. One issue that we have not considered is that Japan itself, the Japanese economy itself, is not very liberalized. It actually has very few free trade agreements with others. So the fact that from the Taiwanese standpoint that the fact that they have not done more with Taiwan in itself may not be sort of yes, I think they are concerned about the PRC, and they actually have a very difficult relationship with PRC too. But my point is that Japan is not a leader. In many ways, it's actually a laggard when it comes to trade liberalization. So their treatment of Taiwan is nothing very special.
Okay, yes, gentlemen.
Oh, thank you very great discussion. My name is Ken Scabe from Marubeni Corporation, Japanese. We are the one of the biggest Japanese investment and trade company. So I just want to follow some previous question in terms of the Chinese invasion, possible Chinese invasion to Taiwan. So I heard that so it should be some warning signals before PRC invade China, because the PRC need a massive mobilization if they want to invade very seriously. I mean invade full scale. So at least half year before invasion. So do you agree with this observation? And my second question is, even if we have a warning like a Russia's invasion on Ukraine. So there we saw a lot of some warning, especially from the Biden administration. But even the European countries or a lot of experts didn't look at very seriously, didn't look at this warning very seriously. So I want to know how we should evaluate this warning before the possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And by the way, I want to make play a very big role to help Taiwan. But yeah, I agree with that, Ambassador Clark. So Japanese government is very conservative on this Taiwan policy. Thank you.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a continuation of earlier question, but on Japan and then I guess Europe. So how do you analyze the European response? Anybody here?
What's that about the European?
I think it's about Chinese invasion. Fine.
So yeah, the first question is,
Right.
I have heard that some experts said we should see a very visible warning before the Chinese invasion, at least before a half year ago, because they need a very massive mobilization. I mean, the military mobilization.
So people who look at this stuff, and I'm not an expert, say that the Chinese military is currently organized or positioned to harass Taiwan, but not to invade it. I don't know if there's a consensus on how long it would take China to organize its forces to put them into an invasion stance. I don't know the answer to that question. Presumably more than one day, but it could be any length of time. I'm not sure. And then in terms of how people would respond to that deployment, I don't know. Good question.
Hey.
Yeah, I've seen those kind of analysis before, and they seem. I'm not a military expert, but I think their analysis seems plausible to me, because if you're talking about a large scale invasion, you cannot escape those signs. It would take a while to build up. But I think that what should be concerning to all of them is that the PRC every day, especially after the August Pelosi crisis, has actually created a new normal. So you will see gradually that they blur the distinction between military maneuvers, which actually take some mobilization, and closer to Taiwan, therefore giving Taiwan less and less space to respond. And then at what point, so if you mobilize 10,000, 100,000 people, that may be a very large maneuver. But then next day you mobilize 120,000. At what point you can actually turn that into an actual invasion? This is my concern.
Okay, I think we had any questions? Yes, down over here.
Thank you guys for the discussion. My name is Josh. I'm an alumni of George Washington University. And I wanted to ask about the kind of energy transformation that Taiwan is going through right now. There was a recent vote that showed a shift away from nuclear energy. However, a lot of industries in Taiwan are very energy intensive, but we see that they're trying to be more creative, like going to fields like offshore wind. How deep is US cooperation with Taiwan on their energy transformation, their energy policy, and what are the biggest areas for new collaboration or opportunity for growth in that specific sector?
Thank you, Josh. This one's O'Reilly.
Did you miss my comments at the beginning?
Yeah.
Obviously, not obviously, I should say, Chinese, where do I begin? Taiwan's energy supply is not significantly reliant on renewable energies. It's maybe 5%, if even. What that means to me is a lot of opportunity for growth, but as you're saying, capture the other 95% is going to take a lot of work. And what we've been seeing is not so much American companies, but European companies, companies from Denmark, Netherlands, some Australian companies as well, investing in particularly wind being a growing one, but there's also geothermal and other types of renewable energies that present a lot of opportunities for growth.
Yes, one last question here.
Thank you, every panelist. I'm Jeffrey Cole. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Economics of George Washington University. This question is addressed to Mr. Walters. You talk about that the production of the semiconductor is the leverage of the Taiwan, but from the perspective of the U.S., this is probably like I think one of the U.S. officials mentioned that this is risky to only rely on Taiwan to produce like the chips that's necessary to we use to produce the electronic devices. And I think weeks ago that Taiwan Semiconductors, they just announced that their new branches in Arizona, they are going to use the 3 nanometers, so which is the most advanced technology to produce their chips. And this raised a lot of concerns in Taiwan. I'm just wondering, like, what's your comment, and do you have any take on this? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. The semiconductor, the way we talk about it over the last couple of years really is it's an interesting one because it does often feel like we're talking past each other. I think if you look at it from the US perspective, they want to reduce their reliance on Taiwan. Semiconductors made in Taiwan, so they're for encouraging manufacturing in the United States. I think Taiwanese companies, on the other hand, recognize that not all production is going to shift. Maybe they can shift a percentage of it, but at the same time, they prefer new partnerships instead. Looking at ways to make sure that the relationship is actually getting closer together and not bifurcated or separated. And so I do kind of wish that the United States, the way that sometimes we talk about the semiconductor industry, for example, along with others, is not so doom and gloom, not so framed in a way that it seems like the United States doesn't want anything to do with Taiwan, because I don't think that's true at all. It's just that maybe they would prefer to see more domestic manufacturing than international.
The U.S. has been jawboning Korea to move plant to the U.S., Taiwan, and they're starting to push back, all of them, and saying, well, if we're friends, why shouldn't the factories be in our countries too? And so there's going to be a lot of give and take, I think, among the companies and the governments in this area over the next decade, with everyone. It's sort of a little bit of it's definitely, there's a competitive element to it, as well as a friendly element, as well as a strategic element. They all get mixed up together. And so if there were specific administration people saying they don't think they worry about semiconductor capacity being on Taiwan, I wouldn't take that as a definitive policy of the government, frankly. I think it's much more complicated than that.
I think it's Jenna in the World Bank annual meeting, I think, yeah, she says so.
Right, and she's not in charge of anything in that area.
I think I rather see this as sort of an attempt to diversify a little bit. Obviously, it will be quite a task for the United States to reproduce the entire supply chain. And in fact, it's much better for the United States to have friendly relations with Taiwan and Korea, and there's a division of labor, and that it's more important to ensure the stable supply rather than actually owning them. I think TSMC former chairman Morris Chang made the point, right? So if you're trying to reproduce this whole thing in the United States, you just can't do it.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this discussion, and I have to say, I want to thank my panelists for handling everything from reaction to invasion strategies by China to investment codes. So we have gone well beyond what was advertised here. I want to credit to my panelists here, and I thank you for such a terrific job today, guys, and please join me in thanking them. Yeah.